I think that for better understanding why France was so angry about AUKUS, it's important to have in mind that this submarine program with Australia was far more just an industrial contract. It was part of a larger strategic partnership we concluded with Canberra, which entailed different dimensions, notably joint exercises, intelligence sharing, interoperability efforts, with a view of building a partnership over the long term. And actually, this was a 50-year contract, which clearly was strategic and key for the French strategy in the Indo Pacific. So clearly, the first reason behind France's anger about AUKUS is the fact that Paris was excluded from AUKUS. And as you said, its interest in the region were overlooked both by Canberra and Washington. The second reason of France's disappointment, I would say, is the way these negotiations were handled, and the fact that France was kept in the dark during several months and was not informed either by Canberra or Washington about these negotiations, even though French authorities addressed that issue with their US or Australian counterparts on repeated occasions. And on their side, they actually reassured France about the importance of the French-Australian submarine program. So this gap between these reassuring words and the actual negotiations, which were excluding France, clearly created, as we said, a breach of trust between France, the US, and Australia. And that's why France decided to recall its ambassadors to Canberra and Washington to signal how important this crisis was and to make sure that what was at stake was not only a submarine program, it was our trust toward Canberra and Washington. Having said that, President Macron and President Biden had quite a productive phone call a few weeks ago where they recognized that things should have been handled differently. And more importantly, they decided to move forward and to launch what we call in-depth consultations between Washington and Paris to build and strengthen our partnership, notably in three domains. First, the Indo Pacific. Second, the fight against terrorism and notably the Sahel. And third, a strong support from Washington to European efforts in the field of defense and security. So the process is now ongoing. This is not the end of this crisis. Clearly, time and more importantly, actions will be needed to restore trust between France and the United States. But still, we have noticed quite substantive and productive talks between French and US officials. And we can hope that when the two leaders will meet again by the end of October in Europe, they will be able to launch a new phase in our partnership. First of all, France sees itself and is actually an Indo-Pacific nation. We have overseas territories across the region with islands in the Indian Ocean, such as Mayotte and La Réunion, and also islands and archipelagos in the Pacific Ocean with the French Polynesia and the New Caledonia. These territories are home to more than 2 million French citizens, and more than 7,000 French soldiers are permanently deployed there to protect our interests. So clearly, France is in the Indo-Pacific region, is really interested by the stability of the region. France also is attached to the multilateralism and the stability of the region when it comes to the freedom of navigation, and sends regularly vessels across the South China Sea, be it its aircraft carriers, such as in 2019, but also frigates, submarines. So France is contributing quite heavily to the multilateral efforts to stabilize the region. France also has deployed a specific Indo-Pacific strategy since 2018, in which notably Paris has strengthened its ties with key actors of the region, such as India, Japan, Indonesia, but also Australia. So clearly, France is an actor. And the fact that this reality, this geographical military reality was overlooked by the White House was clearly a disappointment for Paris, because clearly the White House was aware of these interests, but decided to, I would say, prioritize its links with Australia at the expense of France. Actually, the French authorities do not understand why Canberra and Washington took such a decision, such exclusive decision, while actually the trend before that was more inclusive, and the fact that the different partnerships, bilateral, multilateral partnerships, were actually complementary and were quite inclusive. Now we have experienced quite a breaking point in that regard with this exclusive Anglo-Saxon alliance at the expense of other actors. And that's why I think this was clearly seen as a huge shock by Paris. But we believe that we still need the US to succeed in the region, and vice versa. The US needs France and other European actors to effectively compete with China. And that's precisely the goal of these consultations between Paris and Washington, to have a clearer view of what are our respective strategies and how we can articulate them. In the short term, I do not necessarily see a participation of France to AUKUS, notably because this program was clearly at the expense of the French-Australian program. So I don't see how we could reconcile these two projects. However, France will stay in the region, will increase actually its engagement in the region, and will, I think, deepen its ties with other actors other than Australia. We have actually noticed over the past few weeks that the French foreign minister discussed with its Indian, Japanese, and Indonesian counterparts quite regularly. So clearly France will maintain its presence in the region, its ties with the region. France also, because of its overseas territories, is part of multiple regional fora, both in the Pacific Ocean and in the Indian Ocean, and I think will play a driving role in these regional organizations. Just to take two examples, France is chairing currently both the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and the Indian Ocean Commission, which play quite an instrumental role when it comes to cooperations on maritime security or the environment. So clearly, France will not leave the region, quite the contrary. Now, the big question mark is, what is the future of the cooperation of France with Australia, the US, and the UK? I hope that we will be able to resume our cooperation with the US and actually strengthen it, and we will see what will be the outcome of the ongoing discussions. It's harder to say when it comes to Canberra and London, because these countries have not engaged in a constructive process similar to the one we observe with the US. So clearly the ball is in the courts of these two countries. For now, they do not appear to be willing to engage in such process with Paris, but clearly time will be needed to restore trust and to re-engage in a form of fruitful cooperation with these countries in the Indo Pacific region. I think that, unfortunately, the decision of London to join AUKUS is indeed part of a larger trend linked to its global Britain policy and its desire to have a more independent voice in the world stage at the expense of its ties, long-standing ties with the EU member states. And we're experiencing now really difficult times with the UK, with many difficult and vexing issues with London, mainly due to Brexit. And now we do not have the political conditions to have a frank and fruitful dialogue with the UK, even though actually we have shared interests. We need both a strong defense ties, because clearly the UK remains a strong and capable country when it comes to the field of security and defense. But the main stumbling block today is political, and the lack clearly of a true dialogue at the political level between EU member states and the UK on a series of issues clearly is a huge hurdle in a strong cooperation. You mentioned that France played a driving role within the EU. This is especially the case when it comes to the Indo Pacific. France was the first EU member state to adopt an Indo Pacific strategy in 2018. It was then followed by other member states, notably Germany and the Netherlands. And the three countries played quite a driving role to push EU member states to adopt their own Indo Pacific strategy. And actually, the day after the announcement of AUKUS, the EU revealed its first Indo Pacific strategy. So there is a shared understanding of the need for EU member states to play a stronger role in the Indo-Pacific region when it comes to maritime security, to trade, to tech, to connectivity. The EU has quite strong tools to have a say, to play a role in the stabilization of the region, and also in the fact that they could offer an alternative model to the Chinese one. So clearly, the EU can play a role. Now the issue is whether the US can acknowledge that or not, whether Washington could work with Brussels on this issue and in this region. So that's clearly also an open question. And actually the joint statement of President Macron and President Biden mentions that, the need for the US to recognize the engagement of the European member states in the Indo-Pacific region. And I hope that this bilateral dialogue will lead to a more constructive cooperation between Europe and the United States in the region. I'm not necessarily an expert on trade issues, but what I can say is that AUKUS is just more than the end of a bilateral submarine program between France and Australia. What is at stake is the trust, the transparency we can have between us and Australia. And as a matter of fact, it can have an impact on the broader relationship between Australia and the European Union, such as it has also an impact on the transatlantic relation. So clearly, Europeans should have in mind that our partners, our ally, the US, Australia, can have a way of doing things which is not acceptable and quite contrary to our notion of what should be an alliance and partnership. And so we should reflect on that, and we should make understand that to these countries that we cannot accept such behavior. And if we want to move forward, not only on security and defense issues in the Indo-Pacific, but on a variety of topics, we need to have trust, transparency, consultation. These are basic rules for a functioning alliance or partnership. So clearly, this diplomatic rift between France and Australia and the US has larger implications for European connections with these countries. I think that AUKUS does not put into question the US commitment toward NATO or Article 5. President Biden was crystal clear in his different interventions about US ironclad commitment toward the transatlantic alliance. However, AUKUS and other recent events, notably the way the US handled the withdrawing of its troops from Afghanistan, are quite revealing of how the US considers NATO and its partners, notably the fact that the US puts an emphasis on its national priorities, its national security interests, sometimes at the expense of the interest of its closest allies. Clearly for Afghanistan, other NATO allies wanted to stay in the country, notably the UK, but were not able to do so. And clearly the US prioritized its national security interests and decided not to take into account the concerns of other allies. So that's the first element, this new hierarchy of priorities within the US foreign policy. The other elements which AUKUS is quite telling is the fact that Europe is more and more marginal in US foreign policy. And clearly we have noticed a pivot toward Asia since the Obama administration, and the Trump and then the Biden administrations have confirmed this long-term shift, where Europe is not at the core of US foreign policy anymore. And clearly, this should be a cautionary tale for Europeans, and they should understand that they need to step up their efforts to be more autonomous, to be able to respond without potentially US support to a crisis in their vicinity. And actually, this is not just a French idea. This is actually also a demand from Washington for the past several years. Washington has been quite clear about the need for Europeans to have more responsibilities and a stronger share in the burden when it comes to defense and security, and Europeans should act accordingly. So clearly, we often use the term of wake-up call and sometimes too much, but these different events should serve, as I said, as a cautionary tales for Europeans on the need to admit, recognize that the US foreign policy is shifting toward Asia, toward their core national interests, and they should respond accordingly and make greater efforts for their own security. I think that we should have two things in mind. First, strategic autonomy does not mean cutting our ties with Washington. Quite the opposite. The idea is to rebalance NATO and to make sure that Europeans have a stronger role, a stronger say for their own security, while preserving their defense ties with Washington. So it's not cutting our partnership with the US, but rebalancing it. France is really advocating that. We actually need the US support in our own national operations, such as in the Sahel, where the US military support is key when it comes to intelligence sharing, to air-to-air refueling, or tactical transport. We need the US support. But in the Sahel, which is quite a good example, France and Europeans are taking a stronger role. They are more and more involved, and clearly they are leading the security efforts there, with the US having a more supportive role. So clearly the question is not having an autonomous, closed Europe, but a more responsible partner toward the US. Now, when we say that Europe should take greater responsibility for its own security, is clearly has a large acceptation, and European security interests do not stop in Europe's neighborhood. Clearly, we have immediate challenges when it comes to Russia's aggressive posture or the threat of international terrorism, notably in the Levant or in the Sahel. But actually, Europeans are also attached to the stability of the Indo Pacific region. We have direct security, economic interest there, and Europeans want to play a role in that region. France is in a specific position because we have, in addition to that, territories there. So we are directly impacted by the instability and the risk of military escalation in the region. So clearly the US should not confine Europe to their immediate security challenges and include them actually in the broader competition with China, which is a competition quite complex. It's not limited to military issues. Actually, to effectively compete with China, we need to leverage other tools in the trade, economic, environmental, legal domains. And clearly the EU has strong tools in that respect and could play a valuable role in this competition. First, our ambassador to the US came back to Washington a few days ago with a clear mandate to launch these in-depth high-level consultations between Paris and Washington. Since then, we have noticed several high-level dialogues and discussions, notably with the visit of Secretary Blinken in Paris. Today, the visit of the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. And these talks were apparently quite substantive and productive, but it's still too early to say what would be the actual result. Both presidents will speak again in a few weeks, mid-October, and then we'll eventually meet in person in Europe. So we will see what would be the outcome of these discussions. What is clear is that the US administration has acknowledged that this was not a temporary crisis and that tangible commitments from Washington were needed to restore a form of trust with Paris. So clearly, the White House is aware of that, seems to be committed to make concrete and positive commitments to France. So I'm quite hopeful that these discussions will have a positive outcome.